sure you want to go through with this?
That's up to you.
You just don't know how good I am.
All right, Kurt. Then you show me.
I'm a child of the 50s. I grew up with have gun, will travel, and Gunsmoke. Always liked playing cowboys and bad guys. And come to find out, we had a past every bit as wild as Dodge Cities or Tombstones or any of those places that I fantasized about when I was a little boy. So that led to the book. This particular spot on the creek became kind of notorious in the 1850s because 1858 to be particular, there was a vigilance committee in San Luis Obispo fighting crime. There was a crime wave here that was rather spectacular. The vigilance committee was modeled on San Francisco's in 1856, by far the more famous, but we have the dubious reputation of having hanged more men than they did. San Francisco's committee hanged 4, we hanged at least 6, maybe more. And where we're standing right now, just behind me, this is where the hangings would have taken place in that summer of 1858. The crime in San Luis Obispo County it was robbery, but it didn't stop at robbery. The gang that terrorized the area in 1850s had a motto, and it was "Dead men tell no tales." So they weren't satisfied with just stealing, they also killed their victims. They left a trail of skeletal remains between the Cuesta Pass, which is north of town, to Santa Barbara. Travelers remarked on coming upon human remains pretty frequently during the 1850s. And the gang that would provoke the Vigilance Committee was actually headquartered in Santa Barbara. And the leader of the gang was the son of Irish immigrants. His name was Jack Powers. He was raised in Hell's Kitchen and the Bowery in New York City. He came to Santa Barbara in 1848 as part of a volunteer regiment to fight the Mexican War. He didn't do much fighting. What he did was what he did best, which was dancing. So the women of Santa Barbara loved him. And he also loved to race horses. So the men of Santa Barbara loved him. Unfortunately, he was also a stone killer. And he was the head of the outlaw gang that terrorized our little county in the 1850s. There's a San Diego State study. The history professor points out that the most dangerous place in America between 2010 and 2015 was New Orleans. There were 47 murders per 100,000 population. If you applied the same formula to San Luis Obispo County in 1858 and extrapolated it to New Orleans, it would have worked out to 178 murders per 100,000 population. There were 11 murders in 1855 alone, which doesn't seem like much, but in a county of under 1,800 people, that's a tremendous amount. And most of the victims were here because of the gold rush. And what local cattle ranchers found out, just as Levi Strauss found out by selling equipment and jeans to the miners, the money wasn't to be made in mining gold. That was for suckers. The money was to be made in supplying the needs of the gold miners. This had always been a cow country, so suddenly there was this immense market that opened up to the north. San Francisco went from 800 people to 25,000 people between 1848 and 49. So there's a tremendous amount of customers up north and in the gold fields to sell beef to. What that meant was there were a lot of cattle buyers, ranchers, cattle brokers carrying gold dust on them. So those were among the main victims of outlaw gangs like Jack Powers. San Luis Obispo County has always been in between. It's always been remote. It's a place where you stop when you're on your way from LA to San Francisco. It's just about exactly midway. But in the 1850s, really up until the 1920s, even during Prohibition, it was so remote that it was ideal for people who wanted to break the law. It was easy for a man like Jack Powers, our outlaw gang leader, to pull a job and then disappear. He had an escape route that went over into the valley, went down. He would eventually wind up south of here in Los Alamos. So its remoteness made it ideal for people who could disappear pretty quickly once they pulled a job. Powers had an accomplice. His lieutenant in San Luis Obispo was a vaquero named Pio Linares. And Linares was a tough man. He was a brawler, he was a barroom fighter. He was like Powers, he was a superb horseman. And his father had once owned much of what is today the Los Osos Valley, which is just outside of town. But Linares was, he was kind of Powers' eyes and ears. So whenever he heard a rumor that somebody would be going through San Luis Obispo County with a lot of cash, he would alert Powers, they would gather the gang together, and they would pounce. And finally came to a head in 1858 because there were 5 murders in rapid succession. 2 of them were cattle buyers, 2 of them were ranchers north of here, a place called Shandon. One of them was a farmer who was shot simply because he'd seen Linares and the bad guys ride by his farm on their way to kill the 2 ranchers. So that led to the formation of the Vigilance Committee. And the head of the committee, the young man who formed it, was named Walter Murray. So Murray formed a Vigilance Committee, and they decided to break up the Jack Powers gang. And they did this, it was pretty short-lived, between May and September of 1858. But they hanged one suspect almost immediately. Then they found Jack Powers' chief lieutenant, Pio Linares, in the Los Osos Valley. There was a two-day running gun battle. One of the posse members, one of the Vigilance Committee members, a young man named Matlock, was shot to death. Walter Murray was shot in the arm. He survived, but they killed Pio Linares. They brought back 2 of his accomplices, tried them pretty quickly in the mission here. That would have been near the end of the colonnade, and they were summarily hanged in front of a crowd of local people. Eventually, they would hang 6 men in all. Jack Powers wisely fled the area. The last we hear of him, he's in Mexico, getting into an argument with another bandit over a woman. It's an argument that Jack Powers loses. He winds up thoroughly dead, and that's pretty much the end of the gang. I think there's maybe something in all of us that secretly admires daring men who get away with stuff. So there's something of glamour. Jack Powers is a great example of that. He was a superb horseman. He was a great dancer. He was a backslapper, the kind of guy who would walk into a bar in Santa Barbara and immediately drinks were on Jack Powers. Everybody loved Jack Powers. But he had this exceedingly evil side, and he was remorseless. So he's fascinating, and I think people like this are fascinating. What leads them to do what they do? Why do they do it? And eventually, almost always you have the satisfaction of kind of having your guilt relieved because they get caught. And that's what happened in almost every case here. A lot of that is because of Walter Murray. The man who formed the Vigilance Committee, I found a tintype of him holding his infant daughter, and he obviously adores her. His tombstone in the San Luis Obispo Cemetery, he died, he was only 49, but it shows a man's hand and a woman's hand clasping the word farewell over the carving. So my hunch is this was a family man. And this was a man who did not want to raise his children in a place that was so incredibly violent. That was, I think, his fundamental motivation. And you have to admit, he accomplished what he set out to accomplish. He broke up the Powers gang. I think one of the reasons I write books, I grew up in a rural area, and we sometimes think that our little hometown isn't that important to the scheme of things. But in my books, what I attempt to do is to link San Luis Obispo County to the greater events of American history. In this case, as somebody who grew up as a fan of Wild Westerns, we were every bit as much a part of the Wild West as any of the Earps or the Bat Mastersons or any of the guys that I idolized when I was a little kid. So I think that reminding people of that there's something colorful and valuable and unique that they may not know about. Most of the people who come to this beautiful Mission Plaza here and enjoy the day have no idea that 5 men were hanged here in 1858. And yeah, it's a little morbid, but it's a reminder of how far San Luis Obispo has come. It was once probably the wildest place in America. And now, as you can see, it's a beautiful town.